The coffin looked too small for the woman who once filled every corner of my life. I remember the sound before anything else, the low hum of the air vents, the scrape of polished shoes against tile, the trembling breath I tried to swallow. My son's words still hung in the air like a curse. You should be lying there instead of her. It wasn't grief that followed, but a silence so deep it felt like time stopped listening. I stared at the mahogany lid and saw every year of our life together reflected in that shine. The garden we built, the dinners we skipped, the laughter that turned brittle in her final months. Around me, faces blurred into one shapeless crowd of pity and gossip, but his face was sharp, his eyes unflinching, a mirror I didn't recognize. Something inside me shifted then, not rage, not sorrow, something colder, an understanding. People think betrayal is a sudden knife, but it's a slow rot, a quiet decay that starts when love becomes entitlement and gratitude turns into demand. As the last condolences faded, I felt the weight of everything I'd ignored, the quiet debts, the small manipulations, the years of being useful instead of loved. My hand rested on the coffin, and I realized I wasn't saying goodbye to my wife. I was burying the last illusion that any of this still meant family. When I turned to leave, the room felt smaller, the air thinner, like the walls themselves wanted to keep the secret. My son watched me go, waiting for some apology, some weakness, but all I gave him was a single look, a promise that I would not die as the man he thought I was. Outside, the wind cut through the parking lot, carrying the smell of flowers and rain. I walked toward my car without purpose, without destination, but with clarity for the first time in years. Behind me, the world kept performing its rituals of grief, but ahead of me stretched the first honest silence I'd known. Something had ended, yes, but something else, something dangerous, precise, inevitable, had just begun. The road stretched ahead like a question I had never dared to ask, the kind that burned behind the ribs for decades. I drove without a map, just the rhythm of the tires on asphalt and the ghost of my son's voice echoing in the cabin. Every mile peeled away another layer of the life I'd built to keep others comfortable. I realized how easily people mistake control for love, how convenience wears the mask of care. My house, my accounts, my years, all traded for the illusion of family unity, for peace that was never real. The headlights cut through the darkness, and I started to see patterns everywhere, how every institution I'd trusted worked the same way my son did. Take, justify, repeat. The world rewards dependence, not integrity. It feeds on people too tired to resist. Somewhere between one town and the next, I understood that what Amos said wasn't just cruelty. It was inheritance. He had learned it from watching me bow, compromise, and call it kindness. That realization hurt more than his words. I stopped at a gas station just before midnight, under buzzing fluorescent lights that made everything look too real. My reflection in the glass door was unfamiliar, a man stripped of reason to pretend. I thought about Meredith, about the way she'd always tried to hold us together, patching the cracks I refused to see. Maybe she knew it would all fall apart the moment she was gone. Inside the car, I turned off the engine and sat in silence, watching the shadows move across the steering wheel. There's a moment when grief becomes clarity, when you stop defending the lie and start tracing its design. That's where I was, halfway between loss and something colder, harder, necessary. I didn't know what my next move would be yet, but I could feel it forming in the distance, like a storm building far out at sea. I took a deep breath and whispered to no one, "You wanted me gone. Let's see what happens when I finally leave." Morning arrived like judgment, too bright, too honest, cut, ting through the motel curtains that refused to close all the way. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the phone lying silent on the nightstand. That small glass rectangle filled with every echo of the life I'd just abandoned. 58 missed calls, 23 unread messages, all from the same voices that once called me family. It was strange how quickly concern turned into accusation, how love decayed into threat once the flow of comfort stopped. I powered it off again, and the silence that followed was the first true peace I'd felt in years. In that stillness, I began to think like a man finally free from hypnosis. I had spent decades tending to other people's needs, mistaking compliance for morality, generosity for meaning. But beneath every thank you was an expectation. Beneath every "you're such a good man" was a quiet demand to keep being useful. Meredith had seen it, even if she never said it aloud. Her kindness had become the shield that allowed their greed to thrive. Now that she was gone, there was nothing left to protect. The coffee in the motel lobby was burnt and bitter, but it woke something I hadn't felt in years, a taste for control. I pulled my laptop from the bag, opened it, and started searching. Property law, estate procedure, revocation of power of attorney. Every link I clicked felt like reclaiming a part of myself I'd let others sign away. The internet is a strange cathedral of desperation. People whispering into the dark about how to escape their own blood. I recognized myself in their stories, the aging parent drained dry by entitlement, the man too polite to defend his own life. The more I read, the more I understood that morality without boundaries is just an invitation to be devoured. By noon, I knew what had to be done. Not revenge, not yet, but something cleaner. I would cut them out, legally, permanently, until there was no trace of their dependency left on my name. The plan didn't scare me. What scared me was how calm I felt making it. Somewhere deep inside, a door had opened, and for the first time I wasn't afraid of what waited on the other side. The attorney's office smelled of expensive paper and practiced disinterest, the kind of place designed to make your pain look small and your file look important. I sat across from a man in a gray suit who spoke in clean, clinical sentences. How to revoke a will, how to sever access, how to file notices that would leave no room for argument. I watched his pen move across a yellow pad and felt something like relief, a surgical certainty replacing the fog of grief. I signed forms with a steady hand I did not recognize. Each signature felt like a stitch closing a wound someone else had been picking at for years. Afterward, I met a woman who called herself a forensic accountant and who opened spreadsheets the way a surgeon opens a chest, methodical, merciless. She showed me line after line of transactions masked as loans and emergencies, transfers into accounts that never saw groceries or utilities, credit card charges for boutiques I had never heard of. The numbers read like betrayal in a ledger. They were not mistakes, they were a plan executed by people who treated kindness like a resource to be harvested. I thought about all the nights I had sat awake beside Meredith's bed, counting breaths and bills, and how in that same time my own name had been used as currency. Walking out of that building, with folders of evidence tucked under my arm, I felt the weight of years lift and the gravity of consequence settle in. The world that had seemed so softly inevitable now looked like an architecture of assumptions, agreements made by silence, rules that existed only because no one enforced them. I began to see how the same mechanisms operated elsewhere, institutions that depended on passivity, families that accepted exploitation because shame kept them quiet, systems that rewarded those who learned to ask without ever intending to give back. My plans took Shah. Not as revenge but as restoration. Change the locks on access. Cancel cards, file notices, prepare affidavits. Actions that were legal, boring, final. I rehearsed conversations in my head, calm, unmoved. No theatrical accusations, just facts laid out like stones forming an immovable path. There was a cruelty in the clarity, the knowledge that exposing theft would wound them but also free me from the obligation of pretending. In the motel room that night I drafted letters, printed copies of bank statements, labeled envelopes like a man preparing offerings at an altar of his own dignity. Each envelope felt like a small reclaiming. Sleep came in shallow pieces, but with it a new vocabulary. Words like boundary, audit, revocation, terms that had weight and would do work where anger would only burn. I had crossed an invisible line between being the man who provides and the man who protects what is rightly his. It was not a line of violence, but of refusal, and in that refusal lay a kind of terrible mercy for the life that remained. The morning light hit different that day, sharp, almost metallic, like the world itself had been scrubbed clean of illusion. I brewed motel coffee that tasted like scorched cardboard, but I drank it anyway. Bitterness had become a kind of fuel. I opened my laptop and reread the letters I'd prepared the night before, each one addressed to a person who had shaped my silence, my son, my brother-in-law, the family lawyer, even Meredith's sister, the quiet architect of manipulation behind the scenes. For years she had played mediator, turning every argument into my apology, every compromise into my responsibility. But now the words on the screen were simple and final. No more access, no more dependency, no more pretense. I printed them, folded them with care, sealed each envelope as if laying a brick in the wall between who I was and who I would be. By mid-morning I drove to the post office. The clerk didn't look up as I slid the stack across the counter, his rubber stamp thudding like a heartbeat, each mark and ending disguised as paperwork. Outside, the sky hung low, heavy with rain, and for the first time I didn't mind getting wet. There was something cleansing in it, as if the storm was mine to claim. I drove past our old house, the one that used to hum with her laughter, now a hollow shell where my son lived surrounded by everything I'd built. His car was in the driveway. I didn't stop. I only watched from a distance, long enough to see the lights flicker on and his shadow move through the window. I wondered if he felt it yet, the shift in power, the quiet unraveling of his certainty. A strange calm settled over me, not triumph, not revenge, just symmetry. Back at the motel, I turned off my phone again. I knew the calls would come, the outrage, the guilt, the familiar cycle of blame. But this time, I wouldn't answer. I sat by the window watching rain draw slow, deliberate lines down the glass, and thought about Meredith. I could almost hear her voice, not soft, not forgiving, but steady. You waited too long to choose yourself. Maybe she was right, or maybe this was her way of telling me that redemption doesn't come from forgiveness, but from finally refusing to be used in the name of love. As night fell, I felt the silence return, not heavy, not empty, but earned. It was the kind of silence a man can build a new life on. The calls came in waves the next morning, first confusion, then anger, then desperation disguised as concern. My son's voice filled the voicemail with the practiced rhythm of a man who believed authority came with youth, each message a variation of the same accusation: selfish, ungrateful, insane. He spoke like someone who had never imagined a version of me that could say no. I didn't listen past the first few seconds. The tone was enough. Control always sounds wounded when it loses its grip. By noon, the motel clerk slipped a note under my door. Someone had been asking questions about me. Describe as family. I smiled at the word. It had become foreign now, like a language I no longer spoke. I packed what little I had: laptop, documents, a half-empty bottle of cologne Meredith once bought me, and left the key on the counter. I drove south without plan or map, just instinct. The highway cut through long stretches of farmland, pale and endless under the gray sky. Somewhere past the county line, I stopped at a diner that smelled of grease and old coffee. The waitress called everyone Hun, and no one looked long enough to care who I was. I liked that anonymity. It was cleaner than forgiveness. As I ate, I watched two men argue in the corner over a bill, both convinced the other owed more. It struck me how easily people confuse debt with devotion. That had been my life's mistake. Treating generosity like proof of love instead of proof of control. When I stepped outside, the air felt lighter, the wind carrying the scent of rain and diesel. I realized I didn't miss the house, the title, or even the idea of being needed. What I missed was the version of myself before I started apologizing for existing. I booked a small cabin a few miles outside town, a place advertised for hunters and drifters, the kind of solitude that doesn't ask questions. That night, as the rain returned, I sat by the window and watched the woods breathe in the dark. For the first time I understood that grief doesn't end. It just changes shape, becomes a mirror reflecting what you refuse to see. Mine showed a man no longer waiting to be forgiven. I poured a drink, raised it to the silence, and whispered, "To what's left." It wasn't a toast to survival. It was a vow to never go back. The cabin creaked with every gust of wind, the wood old enough to remember storms far worse than mine. I woke before dawn, the kind of gray hour when even the birds hesitate to speak. The world felt suspended, quiet but listening. I made a fire, brewed coffee that tasted like smoke, and sat in the half-light with the folder of documents spread across the small kitchen table. Numbers, signatures, dates, they used to intimidate me. Now they looked like coordinates to freedom. I went through each page slowly, marking what was mine, what had been stolen, and what I was ready to burn. The legal process was still moving. Letters received, accounts frozen, calls ignored. Somewhere out there, my son was learning that control had consequences. I imagined his face when the bank told him access was revoked, when the cards stopped working, when the world he built from my effort began to shrink. A part of me wanted to feel guilty, but guilt had no oxygen left in me. It had burned away with the years I spent bending to other people's comfort. The storm outside grew louder, branches brushing the windows like reminders that nature prefers chaos to order. I opened my notebook and began writing. Not confessions, not apologies, just truth. Every lie I had tolerated, every compromise I'd mistaken for love, every silence that cost me a piece of myself. The pen moved faster than my thoughts, pages filling with the raw, unedited history of my obedience. When I finally stopped, I realized what I'd been writing wasn't just reflection. It was instruction. A record of how it happens, how good men disappear under the weight of obligation, how families turn gratitude into debt, how love becomes a weapon for those who fear independence. I didn't know if I'd ever show it to anyone. Maybe it was enough that it existed, proof that I had finally seen the pattern clearly. The fire cracked, sending sparks up the chimney, small and defiant. I closed the notebook, placed it beside the documents, and leaned back in my chair. The storm eased. Outside, the forest glistened, washed clean. I felt something unfamiliar, peace, but not the fragile kind that needs approval. This was a quieter, older peace, the kind that comes when a man finally stops asking permission to exist. The next morning arrived draped in fog so thick it felt like the world had forgotten its outlines. The forest was silent, except for the slow drip of dew falling from the roof onto the porch. I stepped outside barefoot, the wood cold beneath my feet, the air carrying the faint smell of pine and rain. For the first time in months, maybe years, my mind wasn't crowded. I made breakfast from the few supplies I'd brought, eggs, toast, coffee, and sat at the table staring at the steam rising from the cup. The quiet didn't feel empty anymore. It felt earned. Around noon, I checked the small prepaid phone I'd bought 2 towns over. No messages, no calls. The world had finally stopped demanding explanations. I opened my notebook again, reread the pages I'd filled, and added more. Not about them, but about me. How I had mistaken endurance for virtue, patience for love, and self-sacrifice for strength. I wrote about the day I'd met Meredith, how she used to laugh with her whole body, how that light had dimmed over time under the weight of keeping peace between me and everyone else. I wondered if she had ever truly been at peace herself, or if she'd just learned to wear serenity like armor. The thought stayed with me, sharp and gentle at once. Outside, the fog began to lift, revealing the slow shimmer of sunlight threading through the trees. I took a walk down to the stream that ran behind the cabin. The water was clear and cold, moving with a kind of certainty I envied. I crouched by the bank, touched the surface, and watched the ripples distort my reflection until it didn't look like me at all. For a moment, I felt the full weight of everything I'd lost. Not just Meredith, or my son, or the life I'd built, but the version of myself who believed goodness required surrender. The grief came quietly this time, not like a flood, but like rain on dry earth. Absorbed, accepted. When I stood, I didn't feel heavy anymore. I walked back to the cabin, lit a small fire, and began to draft something new. Not a will, not a letter, but a plan. Not for revenge, but for living differently. Cleaner, quieter, and unapologetically on my own terms. I didn't know what shape it would take yet, only that it would begin here, in this cabin, with this silence that had finally turned from punishment into peace. The days began to blend together at the cabin, not in the dull way time used to pass, but in a rhythm that felt almost sacred. I woke with the sun, chopped wood, cooked simple meals, and spent the afternoons walking trails that wound through the forest like veins. Each step loosened the knots that years of compromise had tied inside me. The phone stayed off most of the time, though sometimes at night, curiosity would win. I'd turn it on, just long enough to see the notifications pile up. Missed calls, unread messages, an email from the attorney confirming the transfers were complete. My son had tried to contest the documents, but everything had been filed cleanly, properly, beyond his reach. I imagined his fury, the disbelief of someone who'd never known what it meant to lose control. It wasn't satisfaction I felt. It was closure. That strange, weightless calm that comes when the storm finally understands it can't touch you anymore. Still, in the quiet hours, I thought of Meredith, not as the woman who tried to keep us together, but as the one who had silently prepared me for this solitude. She had known what was coming, I realized. She had seen it in both of us long before the words were spoken. Maybe her leaving wasn't just death, but an act of release. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, I found myself talking to her out loud. I told her about the cabin, the firewood, the rain, the peace I'd found not through forgiveness but through clarity. The words felt strange at first, then necessary, like prayer without an audience. When I finished, I half expected the forest to answer back, but it didn't. It only held my silence and gave it room to breathe. That night, I dreamed of the old house again, only this time it was empty, the rooms echoing with nothing but wind. I woke before dawn, heart steady, mind clear. The dream didn't scare me, it felt like permission. I realized then that what I'd built wasn't an escape but a beginning. The man who arrived here running from the past had been replaced by one willing to walk toward whatever waited next. Without apology, without inheritance, without chains. The 10th morning felt different, lighter, as if even the air had decided to stop carrying the weight of the past. I woke before sunrise, the sky just beginning to pale behind the pines. There was no sound but the faint rustle of leaves and the crackle of the dying fire. I sat up slowly, realizing the restlessness that had haunted me for months was gone. The anger, the grief, the constant replay of what had been said and done, all of it had quieted, leaving behind something steadier. I brewed coffee, the same bitter brand from the motel, and watched the light spill across the table, touching the stacks of papers I no longer needed. The documents, the evidence, the plans, they had served their purpose. Now they felt irrelevant, like tools left behind after the work is finished. I gathered them neatly, carried them outside, and fed them to the fire. The pages curled, blackened, and lifted into the air, breaking apart into soft gray fragments that disappeared into the wind. Watching them burn didn't feel like erasing the past. It felt like releasing it. For the first time, I wasn't trying to fix anything or prove a point. I simply wanted to live without carrying ghosts. I took a walk down the trail that led deeper into the forest, farther than I'd gone before. The trees thinned eventually, opening to a small clearing where the world felt impossibly wide. I stood there for a long time, breathing in the damp scent of earth and pine, the silence deep enough to feel alive. It occurred to me that peace isn't something you find. It's what remains when you stop fighting for control. I thought about my son, not with bitterness but with a strange, quiet hope that maybe one day he'd to learn what I finally had, that love without respect is just possession wearing a prettier name. The wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of water from somewhere beyond the trees, and I followed it until I reached the stream again. The same one from before, only this time I didn't see my reflection. I saw movement, flow, continuation. I knelt, touched the water, and smiled. I wasn't running anymore. I wasn't trying to become anyone else. I was simply here, alive, unowned. And in that stillness I realized the story wasn't about loss or revenge after all. It was about reclamation. That night, the stars seemed closer, like they'd crept down just enough to listen. I sat outside the cabin with a single candle burning on the porch rail, its flame trembling in the wind. The forest was silent except for the occasional chirp of some nocturnal creature far off in the dark. I'd grown used to that quiet, but tonight it felt charged, almost expectant, as if something unseen was drawing near. I took a sip of whiskey, slow and deliberate, and stared into the dark tree line where shadow met shadow. My thoughts drifted to Meredith, not to her death, but to the way she lived. She'd believed in cycles, in the idea that life and decay were partners in the same eternal dance. Everything that falls apart, she used to say, is just finding a new form. I hadn't understood it then. I think I do now. The destruction wasn't punishment. It was necessary transformation. The family I thought I had, the illusions I'd built, the obedience I'd mistaken for love, they all had to collapse for me to see what was left underneath. Truth. Hard, cold, unglamorous truth. I wasn't the victim of my son's greed or my own naivety. I was the architect of both. I had taught him comfort without consequence, loyalty without gratitude. I'd fed his entitlement, hoping it would grow into affection. Instead, it grew teeth. F. Lame flickered violently for a moment, and I realized the whiskey bottle was empty. I laughed, quiet, almost disbelieving. How strange that peace could come wrapped in ruins. I looked up at the stars again, and for the first time they didn't feel distant. They felt like witnesses. And I wondered if somewhere Meredith could see me now. Not as the broken man who'd watched her die, but as the one who finally learned what she tried to teach all along. I whispered into the dark, "You were right." The trees swayed, almost answering. In that movement, in that quiet acknowledgement, something inside me shifted again. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was beginning to live. I didn't know what would come next, and for once, I didn't need to. I had nothing left to prove, nothing left to protect. Only the truth, and that, at last, was enough. Morning came gray and heavy, with clouds hanging low enough to scrape the tops of the trees. I woke to the smell of rain drifting through the open window, soft and earthy, the kind that makes everything feel temporary. I brewed another cup of coffee and sat by the window, watching the first drops ripple across the dirt path outside. The silence was no longer emptiness. It was presence. Every sound mattered now, the hiss of the kettle, the sigh of the wind, the rhythmic tapping of rain on the tin roof. For months, I'd filled every moment with noise, music, phone calls, television, anything to drown out my own thoughts. Now I found myself craving the stillness that once terrified me. It was strange how peace could feel like both a beginning and an ending. I picked up a letter I'd written the night before but hadn't sent. It was addressed to Amos. The handwriting was deliberate, steady. I read it again quietly. "Son, I'm not angry anymore. I understand you acted from the same fear I once did, the fear of not being enough. But what you've taken from me you can never keep. Not the house, not the money, not even the power you thought you had. Because none of it was ever real. Only time is real. And I've decided to stop wasting mine." I folded the letter neatly and sealed it, though I wasn't sure if I'd ever mail it. Maybe the words were just meant for me. The rain grew heavier, drumming against the glass like an impatient messenger. I stepped outside and let it soak through my clothes. The cold bit into my skin, but it felt honest, cleansing. The forest shimmered, alive again. In the distance, thunder rolled like a memory trying to find its way back. I thought about everything I'd lost. Meredith, the years, the illusions, and realized it had all been payment for this clarity. To see the world stripped of pretense, to stand unguarded beneath a storm and feel no fear, that was the real inheritance. I raised my face to the rain, eyes closed, and whispered, "Let it wash away." The thunder answered again, closer this time, like a promise. For the first time, I didn't seek shelter. I stood there, letting the rain erase every name, every betrayal, every trace of the man who once thought love was ownership. When it stopped, I would begin again. The rain had ended by dawn, leaving behind a world reborn in silver mist. The forest floor steamed softly as sunlight pierced through the canopy, turning droplets into fireflies of morning light. I walked barefoot down the path, the soil cool beneath my feet, and each step felt like an unspoken vow to never return to who I had been. The cabin stood quiet behind me, just a silhouette fading into the mist, and for the first time I didn't feel bound to it. I'd spent too long mistaking walls for safety, silence for peace, compliance for love. Every lie I'd lived had been built on that confusion. Meredith once told me, "You can't awaken inside a story you refuse to end." I think she knew this moment would come. As I reached the stream again, I saw the charred remains of the papers I'd burned days earlier. A few blackened fragments clung to the rocks. Contracts, signatures, words that, NCE defined my worth. I crouched and touched them. They crumbled instantly, weightless, free. That's when I realized something powerful. Destruction isn't the opposite of creation. It's the gate that leads to it. For everything new to live, something old must die completely. And maybe that was my final lesson. Not revenge, not justice, but transformation through annihilation. The sound of rushing water grew louder, steady, endless, and I understood why ancient people called rivers sacred. They remembered what men forget. They never stopped moving. I followed the stream until it widened into a lake, glassy and still, reflecting the sky like truth itself. I stood at the edge, and in the reflection, I didn't see guilt or grief or the hollowed-out man who'd buried his wife and lost his son. I saw continuity, an unbroken line of survival written in quiet defiance. The past no longer held dominion over me. It was history now, a dark teacher whose lessons were finally learned. I picked up a flat stone, cold and smooth, and skimmed it across the water. It skipped 6 times before sinking. I watched the ripples spread outward, wider and wider, touching everything. That was the real legacy. Not the house, not the wealth, not even the bloodline, but the echo of awareness that keeps moving long after you've gone. When the last ripple faded, I smiled, not with triumph, but understanding. The war was over. I'd finally won by refusing to keep fighting. By the time the sun reached its highest point, the forest had shed its mist, and light poured through the trees like revelation. I sat on a fallen log near the lake, the world still dripping from the morning's rain. Everything smelled alive: pine, soil, renewal. I had no destination, no schedule, no identity beyond breath itself, and in that emptiness, something extraordinary happened. I stopped waiting for forgiveness. For months, I'd carried a quiet ache for closure, from my son, from Meredith's ghost, from life itself. But sitting there, surrounded by the indifferent perfection of nature, I understood there would never be an apology deep enough to rewrite the past. And that was freedom. Forgiveness, I realized, is not a gift we receive. It's one we give ourselves when we finally accept the story as it is, without needing it to end differently. I looked up, watching a hawk circle high above the lake, effortless in its command of the air. That's what truth felt like, weightless but fierce. A whisper echoed through my mind, my own voice, calm and certain. You are no longer a prisoner of what was. The words landed like a verdict, and for once I didn't resist them. I took out my phone, dead for weeks now, and turned it on. The screen flickered to life, flooded instantly with messages, missed calls, texts, voicemails. Amos, Celeste, unknown numbers. Each one a thread trying to pull me back into a life that no longer fit. I didn't read them. I scrolled once, then held the power button until the screen went black again. Then, without ceremony, I placed the phone on the log beside me and watched it for a while. The reflection of sunlight on its dark surface looked almost sacred. I picked it up, drew my arm back, and threw it as far as I could into the lake. It hit the surface with a dull splash and sank without a trace. No ripples lingered, no echo returned. That was the moment I felt the final chain fall away, the illusion of connection, the digital ghost that had kept the dead alive far too long. Silence returned, not as absence but as arrival. For the first time in my life, I wasn't reacting to anything. I was simply being. The world, vast and unbothered, didn't need me to explain myself. It just needed me to exist. And so I did. The evening descended slow and golden, folding the forest into amber and shadow. I built a small fire near the water's edge, not for warmth, but for ritual. There's something ancient about fire, something that reminds a man he's both creator and destroyer. I sat beside it, listening to the soft crackle as the flames devoured a handful of dry twigs. The lake reflected the firelight, a second blaze flickering in the dark water, and for a moment it looked like 2 worlds mirroring each other, the one we live in and the one beneath, where all our hidden selves wait to be seen. I thought of Meredith again, but not as a memory, more like a presence woven into the quiet. Her voice whispered through the leaves, not words, but feeling, the kind of knowing that needs no sound. I closed my eyes and saw her tending the garden, sunlight in her hair, the rhythm of her hands as she planted what would one day outlive her. That's what love really was. Not possession, not permanence, but the courage